Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to History 1302. Our first major topic is going to be Reconstruction 1863 to 1877. Now, I usually open up with a lead-in slide like you're seeing here, and it just gives you a basic overview of what you're going to be seeing. And the structure of my presentations, I try to make them always the same. When we have a major topic, it'll be a thesis statement, maybe a little bit of background information, and then the various major topics, and then a conclusion. And at the end of the day, and this should be kind of a hint to you, that is a basic structure of any essay. So what you're really watching here is a video essay. It's a thesis and an introduction, and then the body paragraphs, as I've said, and then a conclusion. So, like any essay, it's going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, then it's going to tell you, and it's going to tell you what I told you. So our first major idea, again, I try to start with this every time, is a thesis statement. Reconstruction was a failure. Reconstruction was a failure. All the major authors that talk about Reconstruction, Eric Foner, his book Reconstruction, Richard White, Reconstruction in the Gilded Age, Shelby Foote talked about this a little bit in his major work, The Civil War and Narrative History. Everybody that talks about this, all the major historians that discuss Reconstruction, indicate very clearly that it did not work. So let's then start with a little bit of background information here. Reconstruction, I have a definition for you. Now, in your note taking, please make a strong note here. Reconstruction is the political reassimilation of the southern states into the Union. Reconstruction is the political reassimilation, not a made-up word, that's a real word, of the southern states into the Union. Reassimilate means that we've got to get them back in. We've got to recollect them. Reconstruction is the political reassimilation of the southern states into the Union. Reconstruction is not rebuilding. Feel free to put that in your notes and underline it. It's not rebuilding. Rebuilding is a separate issue. So with that, let's start with kind of a basic. So Reconstruction is a political issue. And in our system of democracy, for any major legislation to work in our system of democracy, everyone basically has to agree with it. The voters out there, the constituency, your voters, they have to agree with it. And the problem with Reconstruction is the North still hated the South, and the South still hated the North. So politically, they're never going to be able to get together, and so Reconstruction can't work. It can't, because the North still hates the South, and the South still hates the North. So on the next couple of slides, the U.S. at the close of the war, that's exactly what I'll kind of be going over. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Reconstruction as a political issue is highly, highly technical. There's a lot of technicalities to it. And the Constitution, which we will be referring to a lot in this course, is part of that technical problem. And so we'll take a look at the constitutional view of Lincoln and the constitutional view of Congress. And again, please take strong notes on that. If you don't get the technical elements of this, then the rest of it makes no sense. Now, just because Reconstruction was going to be a failure, well, Lincoln didn't know that. And it is a political issue. It's going to be extremely difficult. That doesn't mean that Lincoln can't try. Lincoln has to try. Lincoln must try. Now, sidebar, and I will use the phrase sidebar a lot in this course. This is something that's important for you to know, but you don't have to put it in your notes. Sidebar, Lincoln defined Reconstruction as bringing the southern states into their more normal relationship with the Constitution. Now, this is deliberately vague. What does that mean? Bring the states into their more normal relationship with the Constitution. Lincoln's being deliberately vague because he doesn't want anybody to suggest that the southern states had actually left the Union. Because that is not his position. Throughout the entire war, he took the position that he has a rebellion on his hands. but that the southern states never left the Union. He talks about constitutionally, he talks about this at length. Constitutionally, they can't. And so the idea of the Southern Confederacy is just something that a bunch of Southern politicians made up. It's artificial. Now, he has a strong reason for doing that, and he never altered from that. He stuck to his guns. Well, that's probably a bad analogy here, but he stuck to his position the whole time. Congress, and we will talk about this more later on, they have a different interpretation. They have strong motives to try and get control of Reconstruction. Then, as you can really briefly, the Johnson administration, as many of you know, Johnson will be impeached. And this is just a big power play. But when it comes to Johnson and Reconstruction, not much is going on there because there's not going to be a lot of time between the time Johnson takes over as president and the time when he is powerless. Then we'll switch to military Reconstruction, congressional and military Reconstruction. I will tell you guys what happened, and then I'll talk extensively about why it happened. Because military Reconstruction is going to be, in broad sense, it's going to be unconstitutional. When you hear what it is, you'll say that's unconstitutional. Then we'll bring it all to an end. We'll bring this all to a close with the election of 1876, which leads to the Compromise of 1877. Then, again, I'll have some conclusions on this, what the price of failure is, what it really meant for the South and for the nation as a whole. So with that in mind, let's get started. Let's take a quick look at the United States at the close of the Civil War. What we're looking at on this map is the United States during the Civil War. And I want to draw your attention to those states that are down there in red and that sort of orange, sort of tan colored. Those were the southern states that had said that they're leaving the Union. Those are the southern states that engaged in the Civil War. The purple states that you see kind of there in the middle, those border states, those are slave states. Missouri, Kentucky, Virginia was West Virginia was part of Virginia going into the Civil War. But then they broke away during the Civil War. They were very northern leaning in their population. But Maryland was a slave-owning state, and so was Delaware. I think they had a whole of like 600 slaves in all of Delaware. So not many. The numbers that you see next to the states, the names of the states, those are the percentage of the white population that actually owns slaves. So I can't overemphasize this. This gets lost in a lot of history telling and in the public perception. Most people in the South did not actually own slaves. Most people did not own slaves. The slave-owning class, these were people that were fairly well off. Now, slavery was widespread, let that fact be known. But most people actually did not own slaves. And so you can see here, for example, Arkansas, only 20% of the population actually owned the slaves. But within that, I do have a statistic for you. And you're going to need this statistic again and again and again, so please make sure you write this down. In the census of 1860, the last census with the United States, before the Civil War, the census showed that in those southern states, the ones that are in that tan color and the ones that are in the red, the population was about 9 million. The entire population was about 9 million. Again, strong note here. About 4.2 million of those were slaves. Slaves were counted as well. They had to be counted for apportionment. So everyone was well motivated to make sure that the census was fairly accurate. As it turns out, when I'm recording this, happens to be a census year, participate. But at the time, 9 million people, of which 4.2 million were slaves. So we're talking about a tiny percentage of the population owning, quite a few slaves each. And that's going to be important. Later on, when we start talking about Reconstruction, who is, what group is going to want to deny any kind of rights to the slaves? What group is going to want to resist Reconstruction? And so that will be important. But as we go through this, those southern states that have been, the war is mostly taking place down in that area. There was some fighting in Missouri, Kentucky, a little bit, as it turns out, in Pennsylvania. A little bit of a tiny, minute portion of the fighting actually took place in the north. But most of the fighting by far and away is going to take place in the south. And that will also have an effect on Reconstruction. So with that in mind, let's go on and talk about why the South is going to continue on to hate the North and why the North hates the South. That's our first major problem that we have to get a grip on. Reconstruction is a political issue, and we have to do the basic groundwork here. It's not going to work because of this continuing malice, and we have to establish that. So let's take a look at why the South in particular is going to continue to hate the North. Therefore, Reconstruction can't work. Now, what I'm going to talk about here more properly belongs in History 1301. But let me start by saying this, strong note here. Reconstruction begins during the Civil War. Reconstruction begins during the Civil War. And so it's proper for us to go back to the war itself and then just discuss as a major topic, as a major theme, what Reconstruction is all about. Now, your book and most textbooks at the survey level, they're going to talk about how, no, Reconstruction is all after the war. It's all after the war. Well, that's not strictly speaking, that is not true. Your textbook, and almost all textbooks are the same on this, want to try and make Reconstruction easy on their students. They want to keep it simple. And they want to date Reconstruction to the Reconstruction Act of 1867. But Reconstruction had been going on during the war, as we're about to find. So it's proper for us to go back to the war and now take this event that I'm about to describe and put it into the context of Reconstruction. In other words, there are political consequences to what's about to happen here, not just military ones. So with that in mind, let's zoom in. And we're talking about an event called Sherman's March to the Sea, 1864. Now, William Tecumseh Sherman was a very a famous general. He's a Northern general, a Union general. He'd been in the war basically since the beginning. He'd actually been in the Army since, the 1840s. And Sherman had a new concept of the nature of war. And this is a political dimension that is really, really important. Karl von Clausewitz had written a book on this, on war, and it came out really in the 1830s. And it's possible that Sherman had read that. A few copies were kicking around. Some were really bad translations. Clausewitz was German, obviously. But Sherman's view of the nature of war very much is evident in Clausewitz's earlier work. So whether or not Sherman read that or not, I don't know. Probably hard to say. Probably he had. But his concept goes like this. A way to win a war is to make a war difficult for the civilians. One way to win is to make a war really difficult for the civilians. Clausewitz talked about how this is a remarkable triangle. It's the civilians, the political leadership, and the military. That's your remarkable triangle. And for a war to be prosecuted, to work, to go forward, all three of those have to be in agreement. Sherman kind of instinctively knew that, and he said, listen, if I can get the civilians to want to stop the war, then the politicians will have to stop it. And the military cannot go on by themselves. So Sherman said, I'm going to make war very hard on the civilians. Now, strong note now, in Lincoln's concept of the war, these are still citizens of the United States of America. Not citizens of the Confederacy, citizens of the United States. And so, he knew this, and Sherman knew this. You simply can't go down there and murder civilians. You can't do that. That's illegal. That's murder. But you can make it very, very hard on the civilians so that they will be strongly influenced to tell their political leadership to end the war. That is our goal here. So zooming in a little bit further, Sherman gets control of the Army of the Cumberland, about 120,000 men. And as you can see from the map up there, those kind of spaghetti trails of blue and red, there's some fighting. Sherman has several battles there. Chattanooga, he wasn't at Chattanooga as it turns out, but the Army was. Then he gets control of the Army. He fights at Resaca and several different other places. And then finally, and this is the important part, he was able to capture Atlanta. He beat Confederate General Joe Johnston and John Bell Hood, and he's able to capture Atlanta. There it is, September 2nd, 1864. And then Sherman embarks on this operation, the March to the Sea. He's going to cut himself loose from his supply chain, and he's simply going to live off the land. And so he gets these soldiers spread out, you know, kind of edge to edge, double arm interval, as we used to call it back in my old Army days. And you get them spread out across that kind of shaded in area. And you say, okay, everybody, start heading for Savannah, Georgia. Strong note, destroy everything in your path. Destroy it all. If there's bridges, burn them. Get across the bridge and then blow it up. Burn it. If you find a tobacco barn, get all the tobacco out of it and throw in a lit torch. It'll burn. If you see a cow out there in the field, milk it and shoot it. Eat it. That was a Confederate cow. You can just do it. Pigs, sheep, chickens, whatever. Destroy everything in your path. And so his soldiers did that. They got down to Savannah, Georgia. The story goes that the good people of Savannah, Georgia, approached Sherman and said, please don't burn our city. Now, Savannah, Georgia goes way back in America's colonial history. It goes way back to the mid-1700s in our colonial history. And so Savannah, Georgia was an important port city and had a lot of history to it. Well, if you go to Savannah, Georgia today, there's a one city square block, and that's all that's left of the city. That's a reminder of our colonial history. Everything else was burned to the ground. It was burned. Sherman rested his troops for, a few weeks, and then he said, okay, we're going to go up to South Carolina. And however bad Georgia got it, South Carolina is going to get it even worse, because that's where secession began back in 1860. South Carolina is going to get it worse. So again, he just lined up all of these guys, side to side, and he started going up into South Carolina, and he said, destroy everything in your path. They got to Columbia, South Carolina, burned it. Got to all these various cities, burned it to the ground. They got into North Carolina and kept on fighting until, basically the war was over with. At one point, Sherman managed to capture a Confederate general who Sherman had personally known before the war, John B. Gordon. And he was talking to Gordon. He said, look at this magnificent Union Army. When we were soldiers before the war, we never dreamed of having an army like this. Beautiful uniforms, and everybody's heavily armed, and artillery, and just all this equipment as far as the eye can see. Isn't it magnificent? And John B. Gordon, he laid it on the line. He said, we don't care about any of that. We hate you, sir. We hate you. And so in destroying all of this is just one example. In destroying all this that's going on in the South, it just engendered, it began this hatred that no one's going to forget. Sherman wanted to end the war, and this was a mechanism for doing that. But it generated a lot of animosity. And so, again, you will see this in all of my presentations. They're very image heavy. Let's go to the next slide and go over use a little bit of image analysis, and as good old Dr. Buchanan used to say, put some meat on these bones. Let's take a look at what this destruction really, really means. So let's do some image analysis. And as we go through this course, you guys, I want you guys to be taking a look at pictures, and don't just like glance at it and say, okay, well, it is what it is. No, I want you guys to be thinking about what you're actually seeing. You take a look at something, and I want you to use your powers of analysis. You guys are raised on television, and so you're very much visual learners. And as your instructor, I want to try and capitalize on that. And one way to do that is use a lot of image analysis. So let's start up there in the upper right, Hampton, Virginia. Now, you can kind of take a look at that structure. Sort of almost in the exact middle of the photograph, that's a guy leaning against a wall there. That's sort of that sort of figure leaning there. That's a guy leaning against a wall. But right behind him, and so just to the right of the center of the picture, I want you guys to take a look at that and try and figure out what that structure is. What is that structure? There's more structure on the far right of the image. There's more in the background. You can see in the center distance. And what are these structures, especially that structure kind of to the right of center? Ladies and gentlemen, that is a chimney. It's a fireplace. You're looking at an open fireplace hearth, and that's a chimney. Stretching off into the background, all those are chimneys sticking up. Kind of to the left center, that little white sort of dash, that up and down dash there, that's a chimney. You're looking at the backside of a chimney in the distance. And so what has happened to all the homes that these chimneys belong to? Well, they've been burned to the ground, obviously. This is Hampton, Virginia, a prosperous town, and it's been completely destroyed and burned to the ground. There's nothing left but wreckage. Let's go counterclockwise here. Take a look at Norfolk Navy Yard. For those of you guys who don't know, obviously a Navy Yard, they build ships there. And based on what you can see, is it possible to build a ship in that area? No, it's all ruins. The warehouses in the background, they're just burned out husks. There's nothing there. You can't use any of that to actually build a ship. It'll have to be completely rebuilt. Norfolk, for those of you guys who don't know, is actually in Virginia. It's on the coastline of Virginia. Going down one, let's take a look at Columbia, South Carolina. Now, Columbia, South Carolina was then the capital of South Carolina. And inside the fence that you see there, kind of going across the picture, inside that, where the photograph is actually being taken, that is the actual Capitol building. In the foreground, all these stones, marble. You know, Columbia, South Carolina had been a state capital since the Revolution. So the Capitol building had been pretty much built already. You know, it was nearly 70 years before. But now here are all these stones in the foreground that have been pulled down, and the Capitol building has been burned. That little dark area there, that little dark structure kind of in the left foreground, that's actually a buggy pulled by a horse. And it's a hot day, so the photographer has an umbrella up. So he's gotten in there, crawled up on top of the ruins of the Capitol building, and taken a picture down into Columbia, South Carolina. So look into the background, and again, what do you see? All the buildings in Columbia, South Carolina, the state capitol, are nothing but husks. They're burned out. The story goes that there would have been a lot of looting because that's why Sherman's army was there. They looted the place. Anything that was of any use to the Confederacy was destroyed. And there's trash and garbage and paper and all kinds of stuff like laying around. Well, as the sun went down, a fire broke out. There was also all sorts of cotton that had been destroyed, and it's like floating around. And a fire broke out, and it started catching all this on fire. In his report, Sherman said he tried to get the men to put the fire out. But they were so used to destroying everything that as many men as he could get to put the fire out, more were starting other fires. They were thinking that orders had been given to burn the city. So whether it was an accident or on purpose, the result is identical. Columbia, South Carolina is burned to the ground. Nobody can even function in that city. Now, these are American cities, American structures destroyed by other Americans, which is the real tragedy of the war. These are Americans fighting Americans in America and creating huge casualties. But from that idea, zoom in a little bit. How do the people of the South feel about the North? They hate them. There's a malice and a hatred going on there that will not be erased. And so when we apply that to the idea of Reconstruction, Lincoln's got his hands full, but he has to try. And we're going to take a look at that here in a few minutes. Now, we're going to go on and figure out what the North's attitude is. They hate just as badly. But as I pointed out, almost all the fighting is going to go on down in the South. Let's take a look at what is motivating the North to really hate on the South. Now, sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, I have images that are very gruesome. I'm not going to sugarcoat history. And the next slide is one of those. And if I tell you that this image is could be disturbing, then expect to be disturbed. That's just the way it is. This is the nature of war. So let's take a look at why the North has this animosity towards the South. Now, what you're looking at here, these are actually fairly tame images of the war. But what you're looking at here are dead bodies. This is not movie stills. This is not some Hollywood prop. These are dead bodies, not one or two or three, but as you can see, dozens of them. These are American soldiers, whether they're Confederate or Union, it does not really make any difference. These are American soldiers shot by other American soldiers in America. Some of these are very famous battlefields in the, what would it be, the lower right, that I happen to know that's from Antietam. In the upper right, I'm pretty sure that's Antietam as well, but the one on the upper left, that's Gettysburg. These are famous photographs. A lot is known about the photographs themselves. So here's what's going on. As you look at this, here's what's going on. Let me zoom out to the macro. Photography as an event is still kind of in its infancy. It's just been begun. The first photograph was taken about 25 years before, but the technology of photography is emerging slowly. And so you have what's called a glass negative. You have a sheet of glass, I don't know, about 8 by 10, something like that, 5 by 7. And then the glass is coated with photosensitive chemicals. Photographic paper had not been invented. That'll be invented about 20 years on down the line by a guy named Kodak, as you can imagine. Well, to take a photograph, you get this big bulky camera all set up. And they're really, really large. They're very bulky. They're hard to maneuver around. Then you look through the lens and you get all the sight aperture. You get zoom in on what you're taking a look at. You adjust it so you have everything in focus. Then you slide the glass negative in, expose it, but then to actually take the picture, you have to expose it to the light, to the image, to the scene that you're trying to take a picture of. Well, that part of a camera today that we take for granted is called a shutter. And it opens immediately and closes immediately. A tenth of a second, something like that. But back in those days, because you have to have a long exposure time, the shutter had not been invented. So the photographer takes the lens cap off. And then you have a long exposure time, 1, 2, 3, 4. He'll count to 10 or 11. The photographer knows how long to expose it, and then he puts the lens cap back on. You use another little device to close, to protect your glass negative. Take the glass negative out, load another one on there, go through it again. It took forever. With a long exposure time, nothing can move in front of the camera. If it does, it will be blurred. Well, the obvious question here, ladies and gentlemen, what's interesting about dead people? Well, they don't move. And so there's a lot of photographs of Union and Confederate dead. They don't move. Now, the photographer, in this case, Matthew Brady, there are other ones, Anderson, another guy named Thompson. There's lots of photographers. And they're not in the business of taking pictures. They're in the business of making money. So they go out there and follow the armies around and take a whole bunch of photographs. Then Matthew Brady, for example, he's one of the most famous. He'll go back up to New York City, get them all developed, and then he'll put on an exhibition. He'll hire some exhibition hall, and he'll say, hey, come and take a look. I'll advertise like anybody else. Come and take a look at all the pictures of the Civil War. And so, as a Northerner, you're going to go up there, you're going to take a look at the exposition. It's 5 or 10 cents to get in, and you see all the pictures. And you might say to yourself, hey, we're going to go see Uncle Jedediah. Okay, yeah, you're going to see Uncle Jedediah, all right. But it ain't the way you wanted to see him. And you go in, and here are all these photographs of dead people. Now, obviously, there are other photographs of, just innocuous bridges or a hill that people fought over desperately. There's a lot of still images of soldiers and equipment. But everybody has this morbid fascination with the dead. George Templeton Strong was a lawyer in New York, and he went to one of these exhibitions and he wrote about it. And he said Matthew Brady has brought the war to our doorstep. And so people see all this, and they just get angry. They see all this death and destruction, and they're like, okay, this is horrifying, as you can imagine. Furthermore, add to that, ladies and gentlemen, war is cheap or expensive. It's expensive. I have a statistic for you. By 1864, the war was costing Lincoln $2 million a day. That's $2,1864 a day, at a time when a working man might make $7 a week, $8 a week. So when we talk about $2 million a day at the time, this is a vast treasure of money today. This would be many hundreds of millions of dollars today. And the only way to pay that is taxation. At the time, mostly a land tax. Lincoln tried an income tax. It didn't work out. We didn't have the administrative infrastructure for an income tax to work. So most of this is a land tax. So your land tax went up dramatically and in a very short period of time. And so even if you had no other connection with the war, you're going to have to pay higher taxes. Not a little bit higher, but a lot higher. Later on, when we talk about Western migration, one of the motives for people to go to the West is escape. And a lot of people in the Northeast are trying to escape those high taxes. Go to the West where they don't have to pay that stuff. So even if you didn't have any connection with the war, you're angry. The war is costing you a vast, vast treasure of money. It's hideously expensive. On top of all the death and destruction. So the North hates the South. The South hates the North, and the North hates the South. But imagine, if you will, Lincoln has to try. Lincoln must try. So with this background in mind, let's start to zoom in on Reconstruction as a political event. And for that, like everybody else, like Congress, like the President, Lincoln, we have to go to the Constitution. So how does the Constitution relate to Reconstruction? Now, obviously, no state had ever tried to leave the Union before. No one had tried that, It's just, this is something completely new. And nobody knew exactly what to do about all this. So both sides, the President and Congress, who are the ones that are like mostly concerned with Reconstruction as an event, they have to go back to the Constitution. Now, there's several places that have an effect on this, but mostly, this is what I want you guys to know. We're going to zoom in on Article 1, Section 10, Article 6, Paragraph 2, and the 10th Amendment. So, Article 1, Section 10. Now, I only have an excerpt here But let me sort of read the most pertinent parts. For you in your note taking, you only need write down the articles. You don't have to write down the entire uh, uh, um, Article 1, Section 10. You don't have to write down the whole thing. Article 6, Paragraph 2. You don't have to write down the whole thing. But know what is important about these articles in relationship to Reconstruction. So, Article 1, Section 10. No state shall enter into a treaty, alliance, or confederation, grant letters of marque and reprisal, coin money, emit bill of credit, and it goes on. Skipping down to the third paragraph, no state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay duty of tonnage, keep troops or ships of war in time of peace, enter into any agreement or compact with another state or with a foreign power, or engage in war unless actually invaded or in such imminent dangers will not admit of delay. And had the southern states done all those things, they had. The Southern Confederacy is called a confederation. It says that is forbidden. You can't do that. They tried to get England and France, even Russia, to intervene in the Civil War. They tried that on several occasions. They kept troops and ships of war in time of peace. They'd engaged in combat operations that were not against a foreign power. No one was in danger of being invaded from, like, I don't know, Canada or Mexico. So they had done all those things. The southern states had violated the Constitution. Please make sure you write that down. Article 1, Section 10, the southern states had violated that. Article 6, Paragraph 2, this Constitution shall, and the laws made thereof, and treaties which are made or which shall be made, are the supreme law of the land. Write this down. That is called the Supremacy Clause. Madison talks about that a lot in the Federalist Papers. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. The last part of that article talks about who has to obey the Constitution, which is, in effect, all of us. No law is greater in the United States than the Constitution. And so the states, again, they had broken the law, the supreme law of the land. They'd broken that, violated it. But observe, ladies and gentlemen, the 10th Amendment. Now let's take a careful look at this. What you see here is the entire 10th Amendment. That's all there is to it. The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to it by the states, or reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Now listen to me. Based on what you know of the Constitution, is secession, that is the act of a state leaving the Union, is secession forbidden in the Constitution? As it turns out, it is not. There is no escape clause. Madison had made sure that there was no way to, once you're in this Constitution, there's no way for the state to get out. So the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by the states, are reserved to the states. So if secession is not specifically forbidden, then in theory, the states can do it. So is secession constitutional or unconstitutional? Well, I don't go for rhetorical questions in this class, but that's the obvious next step. Is secession constitutional or unconstitutional? The answer, ladies and gentlemen, is that we had to fight the Civil War to figure that out, and that was an expensive lesson. I have a statistic for you. In the course of the the Civil War, about 700,000 were killed in action. Most textbooks and most history books go with 630,000, but that's incorrect. Other historians have come along, and I agree with them. And they say that, listen, that's 630,000, that's based on the combat returns at the time. But many, many, many of those soldiers will die within a day or two of being in the hospital. In other words, they were listed as wounded, and then they died. Well, those actually belong better under killed in action. So the number of soldiers killed in action, about 700,000. Maybe a little bit lower, probably quite a bit higher. but around 700,000, plus another million wounded, plus another million died of disease. Disease will be the biggest killer of soldiers well into the 20th century. So that's almost 3 million dead or wounded in the Civil War, and that's an expensive lesson. That's an extremely expensive lesson. It's 3% of the population. If we had that today, there'd be over 30 million people. So both sides, both the president and Congress, had to go to the Constitution to figure it out. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and talk about Lincoln and his ideas on Reconstruction. Then we'll talk about the Wade-Davis bill, and that is Congress's reaction and their solution for Reconstruction. So again, listen to how both sides used the Constitution to support their political position. Let's take a look at Lincoln and Reconstruction. So again, let's start at the start. Reconstruction begins during the war. Both sides, both Congress and the president, Lincoln, have to figure out how to get these southern states back into the Union. And Lincoln's interpretation was that secession was illegal. The southern states had violated the Constitution when they left and then engaged in a war. A war for what the southern states thought was their independence. Now, in our system of laws, when you violate the law, listen to me, it is up to the executive to deal with that. That is an executive issue if you violate the war. If you violate the law. So, let's say you're driving around out there on the street and you get caught speeding. The cop, the law enforcement guy, wrote you the ticket. And he is a representation of the executive branch. He works for the chief of police, who works for the mayor, who presumably works for the governor. Yes? If it's a state policeman, then he works for his, a police captain who works for the governor. And so they're enforcing the law. Now, the law on that particular stretch of highways that said this is the speed limit, that was the legislation. They took all sorts of information and they said, okay, we're going to make it so that the speed limit in that area is so and so many miles an hour. You disagreed with the ticket. The cop said you were doing 70, you were doing 30, and you disagreed with the ticket. So you take it to the judiciary, and that's the way it works. So Lincoln says the southern states had violated the law, and that makes it an executive function. Ergo, Reconstruction is an executive law enforcement issue. Strong note. It's not on the slide. Strong note here. Lincoln had two goals for the war: end the war quickly and preserve the Union. Sidebar, note that free the slaves is not on his list of things to do. That will happen later. Sort of late 1863, Lincoln changes things around a little bit and makes the war about a higher cause: free the slaves. But in the time frame we're talking about, 1861, 1862, especially late 1862, Lincoln says, no, my goals for the war are end the war quickly and preserve the Union. Please write that into your notes, underline it, stars next to it, fingers pointing at it. Emphasize that in your notes. Therefore, Lincoln had to make Reconstruction easy. Please write that down. Lincoln has two goals for the war: preserve the Union, I have it up there, save the Union, and end the war quickly. So he has to make Reconstruction simple. It has to be easy, so that the southern states will be well motivated to stop fighting and come back into the Union. Lincoln's plan then is called the 10% plan. Now, another little sidebar. Uh, this particular slide and several other ones are a little bit atypical for me. I don't usually have a whole lot of verbiage on them. The next slide, it will also have a whole lot of verbiage on it. Well, that's because of the technical nature of Reconstruction. So because this is highly technical, ladies and gentlemen, strong notes here. Another note on your note taking. You can see here that I have these bullet points marked by those little lozenges, okay, those little diamonds there. And so if I give you bullet points, write that down and then wait for me to explain it. Write it down and then wait for me to explain it. Then I'll transition and go to the next bullet point. If you try to write all this down, then you won't have me explaining it and you'll get lost in your notes. So, Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction. It's going to be easy because he wants to preserve the Union and the war quickly. And it's going to be called the 10% plan. Our first bullet point, it is based on the voter registration in the 1860 election. Now let's pick this apart. This is genius. Lincoln is a genius. That usually gets lost in our hero worship. We want to make him all about the guy who liberated the slaves, and he did do that. But behind the scenes here, behind that icon image, is a man who's really, really, really super smart. He's a genius. So it's based on the voter registration in the 1860 election. The 1860 election is the last election wherein the entire nation voted. That's the last election before the war. It's the election that brought the war on. It's the election that brought Lincoln into office. And at that time, a voter was a white male landowner. This is a little bit of a generalization. Some of the states had some changes into it, but in broad terms, a voter at the time was a white male landowner. So again, let's pick this apart. So 10%. 10% of the voting population in the 1860 election. In your notes, not the general population. It's not 10% of them. It's 10% of the voters, which sounds like a multiple choice question to me later on. So, if you have 10% of any population group, can you get at least 10%, 1 out of 10, to do something? You know, if I had a classroom with 30 students, could I say, and I use this analogy in classrooms all the time. If I have a classroom with 30 students in it, could I say, okay, if 3 of you will go out and play a practical joke, take some Vaseline and smear it on everybody else's car window. Don't ever do that, by the way. That's a bad practical joke. But if just 3 of you will find everybody else's car out in the parking lot, the other 27 students find their cars in the parking lot and smear a little bit of Vaseline on their windshield, take a picture of it to show that you did it, bring it to me. I will give you an A in this class, and you never have to show up another day. No test, no nothing. You get an A. I have that power, which is true. Could I get 3 people out of 30 to do that? Well, the answer, of course, is yes. Everybody knows that instinctively. So Lincoln's gambling that there's 10% of any one of these southern states, 10% of those voters did not want the war in the first place. So they're certainly going to do what Lincoln wants done here. He can get 10% to do that. That's a pretty low bar. Lincoln has 2 goals for the war, and the war quickly preserved the Union. The second thing that we need to take a look at, white male landowners. Here Lincoln, strong note, Lincoln is signaling to the southern population that the people who were in charge before the war will be in charge after the war. And this is brilliant. There's no restriction. There's no further penalty. 10% of the voter registration in the 1860 election, white male landowners. If just 10% of you will do the rest of the things I want done, you're in. This is genius. The same people who were in charge before the war will be in charge after the war. So let's go on to the next part. As soon as 10% had taken a mild oath of loyalty, it's not a whole lot, I promise to be a good citizen and not shoot at Yankee soldiers anymore, then you're done. And had abolished slavery in the state constitution. It's not on there, you have to write that part down. Had abolished slavery in the state constitution, then they're done. That state government could come right back in. Strong note here. Again, it's not on the bullet point. Strong note here. 3 states, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee. Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee were reconstructed under the 10% plan. Now, again, other historians will say, well, yeah, but wait. And sure enough, Congress is going to do a do-over. In the Reconstruction of 1867, which is going to be after the war, Congress is going to say to Louisiana, Tennessee, and Arkansas, okay, you're not reconstructed after all, which makes them all the more angry. Okay? They do a backseat, they do a redo. But my position here is Reconstruction begins during the war. Lincoln's plan was put into action, more about that in a minute, and 3 states, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee, they were reconstructed under 10%. They did it. That's a historical fact. So the 10% plan, Lincoln's going to put it into action. Again, more about that in a second. And it was working. The next bullet point, build a stronger Republican Party in the South. Now, this is going to be important in a few minutes, but let me go over it right now. So, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm about to say is going to be confusing. It's going to be confusing. I told you that all this is highly technical, and it is. So let's take a look at this. Build a stronger Republican Party in the South. Now, Lincoln was in the Republican Party, and the Republican Party in American history is a fairly new party, 1856 or so. Well, the Republican Party at the time, their political ethos, their political platform was the opposite of conservative. The Conservative Party of the time was the Democratic Party. I will say that again. The Conservative Party of that era was the Democratic Party. If you take a look at some of these strong Democrats, let's say Jefferson Davis, the president of the Southern Confederacy, he'd been in politics for a while before the Civil War, and he'd always been very conservative. Alexander Hamilton Stevenson, the vice president of the Southern Confederacy, he'd been a senator from Georgia, and he was an ultra-conservative. Joe Brown from Georgia. He was the governor of Georgia. Ultra-conservative. John Breckinridge had been the vice president under the previous president, Buchanan. And John Breckinridge had run for Congress. He'd run for president, and he was an ultra-conservative. So when we take a look at the Democratic Party, they are all conservatives. And that means the Republican Party is the opposite of conservative. Notice that I do not use the phrase liberal. That is anachronous. Anachronous is a highfalutin college word that means out of time. It's out of its proper time. In other words, the phrase liberal, as approached to in political terms, that's a phrase that comes from the 1960s. Nobody would have understood the use of the phrase liberal back in those days. It would not have worked. So when we take a look at Lincoln, he's the opposite of conservative. Well, build a stronger Republican Party in the South. So there's a built-in population in the South who would vote Republican and associate themselves with the Republican Party immediately if they could. And that is these freed slaves, freed African Americans. The party that was associated with slavery, with enslaving them, was the Democratic Party, which is true. And so the minute these African Americans could get the vote, as the minute they were free to get the vote, then imagine that they're going to gravitate towards the party in a way that had liberated them. So what's going on here? Again, this is Lincoln the genius. You have to think. The 10% plan says the voter registration of the 1860 election, white male landowners, you're going to be in charge after the war. Then it goes on to say, okay, you're going to have to get rid of slavery. But giving African Americans the vote and recognizing them politically is not part of the 10% plan. It is not. Lincoln's hinting this. After the war, he's going to go down there, send political operatives down there and say to African Americans, hey, we're going to give you the vote. We're going to protect that. And so vote for us. Now look back at your statistic. 9 million in the South, of which 4.2 million are black. That's going to be, if Lincoln can pull this off, that will be a huge addition to the Republican Party. At least you'll have more of a balance, and it won't be just Democrats running the South. It won't be just conservatives running the South. And that's actually good for the southern states. Wade Davis veto. So listen to me carefully. Again, this is highly technical. Strong note here. The 10% plan was put into action first. But the first plan came from Congress and is called Wade Davis. It's named after Senator Benjamin Wade of Ohio and Representative Henry Davis from Maryland. Benjamin Wade, by the way, was a very powerful senator. The other senator from Ohio happened to be John Sherman, which was William Tecumseh Sherman's brother. So they had put together a bill called Wade Davis. Strong note now, and we're going to talk about Wade Davis in a minute, extensively. So Benjamin Wade and Henry Davis, along with other members of Congress, had spent a lot of time and effort on this, and they'd come up with a bill. Strong note now, Congress has to answer more directly to the ordinary people than the president does. Because Congress has to get reelected, had to go through election every 2 years. So the Congress that we're talking about had gotten elected in 1860, and now here we are going into 1862, an election year for Congress, for the House of Representatives, and they have to answer to the people. And the people of the North are flaming furious. They are lava hot. They are mad. And so the Wade Davis bill reflected that anger. Congress got it all ready to go and presented it to Lincoln. Now, when Lincoln saw this, I imagine it gave him some gray hair, as you will see in a moment. But so he knew he had to kill it. Now, listen, Wade and Davis and all these other guys are Republicans. They're in the same party as Lincoln. So how can Lincoln kill this and not offend his own party? Aha! Again, Lincoln the genius. Lincoln knew that in our Constitution, in Article 1, it says, any bill that is not passed at the end of a congressional session is automatically killed. If you like the bill and you want the bill, bring it back in the next congressional session, which lasts 2 years. So the congressional session started in 1860, is ending in 1862. Wade and Davis finally have a bill ready. At the end of 1862, they give it to Lincoln for signature. And Lincoln knew the congressional session was about to end. So he took the bill, he literally folded it up, put it in his pocket, and then simply waited until the congressional session ended, and that killed the bill. Hence the phrase, pocket veto. This is a pocket veto. The president can get the bill, hang on to it for just a few days, maybe a couple of weeks, let the congressional session end, and bam, the bill is killed. Well, did he veto it? As it turns out, he did not. He simply let a technical part of the Constitution kill it. So did that make his Republican colleagues in Congress mad? Well, of course they were upset. They didn't get their way. But that's not the same thing as an actual veto where he stamps it with the phrase veto and puts his signature on there. I'm not going to do it. That's not what happened. Strong note. The pocket veto of Wade Davis bought Lincoln time to come up with a 10% plan and time to put it into action. Vetoing Wade Davis with a pocket veto killed the bill, which it needed to die, as we're about to find out, and gave Lincoln time to come up with his own plan for Reconstruction. And again, this is genius. So he came up with a 10% plan, put it into action, and Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee were reconstructed that way. So with that in mind, let's take a closer look at Wade Davis and find out why Lincoln had to kill it. As soon as you see it, you're going to say, okay, Lincoln had to kill this. Let's start then with the Constitution, Congress's position on Reconstruction. Again, as I just pointed out in the previous slide, Congress is enraged over the war. The South has engaged in these combat activities, and thousands of men are dead. It's horrifying. It's costing a vast treasure of money. All throughout 1861 and part of 1862, most of 1862, the North kept getting beat. And Congress is absolutely livid. The people of the North are absolutely furious. So the members of Congress had to go back to the Constitution, just like Lincoln, and figure out if they can get control of Reconstruction. Now, strong note here, I'm on that, third one down. Reconstruction was a congressional function. Now, listen to me. Congress is saying that there's a flaw in the Constitution. Think of that slide where I talked about the Constitution. Article 1, Section 10, Article 6, Paragraph 2, and the 10th Amendment. Okay, so if you look at that analytically, there are two parts of the Constitution which are saying different things. Article 1 and Article 6 are saying you can't secede from the Union. Essentially, it's implying that you can't become independent states. You can't do that. But then the 10th Amendment is saying, well, maybe you can. So Congress says there's a flaw in the Constitution, and that is constitutionally strictly a legislative function. To fix a flaw in the Constitution is a legislative function, and that is only Congress. And so Congress is saying, since there's a flaw in the Constitution, it's up to Congress to fix it, and therefore we get Reconstruction. Make sure you wrote strong notes on that. Congress indicates that there's a flaw in the Constitution. When it comes to secession and fighting a civil war, it's the result of a flaw in the Constitution. And only Congress can fix it, which is true. Therefore, Reconstruction has to be a congressional function. So let's put all that together. Congress's idea about Reconstruction then is to punish the South. They're unrepentant over the war. That means that they're not saying they've done anything wrong, that they have every right to fight this war, and that everything they've done in this war is completely legal and above board. They did it because they felt that it was right. 700,000 dead. That's to the good. What? No. And so Congress is really mad. And the people of the North are saying, punish the South. Put your muddy boot on the neck of the South and hold them down. Put their face right in it. Stick it to the South. Which leads us then to the provisions. Okay, so where did Lincoln come up with this percentage? He came up with it from Congress. Wade Davis, they indicated this. But Congress is saying 50% of the population, it's not in there, you have to write this down, of the population of the 1860 election, the voters in the 1860 election, 50% have to swear an ironclad oath of loyalty. Now, that's a whole different proposition. Before, it was only 10%, 1% in 10. Now you got to get half of them. And was Congress ever going to be able to get half of the voters in the 1860 election to agree with this? No. That was never going to happen. When it comes to politics, it's hard to get 50% of the population to agree to anything. They won't agree that the sky is blue. Furthermore, there was an ironclad oath of loyalty. It's not some simple thing where it's like, oh, I agree to go back home and be a good citizen. That's not it. You had to do all this stuff. Well, when somebody's actually presented with the idea of, okay, raise your right hand and swear after me, and then there's all these accusations and all these horrible things that you've got to swear to, nobody wants to do that. You get resentment fast. So even with just that first bullet point, Lincoln knew that Wade Davis wasn't going to work. The next one, no debt incurred. That means that any debt that they had built up because of the war, no debt incurred by the Confederacy was to be assumed. That debt was not going to be paid. Strong note. Now, this is a sidebar, but it's a very important one. So if you need to write this in your notes, write it in your notes. One of the mechanisms that the nation used to raise money for the war was to issue war bonds, B-O-N-D-S, war bonds. Now, a war bond, you can eBay these things. You can get a Confederate war bond for like next to nothing. There's so many of them out there. But a war bond looks like a corporate check. Not these little checks that you write, to the grocery store or something, but a corporate check, one of these big checks. And it'll have some scroll work on it. It'll have somebody's picture on there. They're really interesting to look at. And it will have a denomination on it, $5, $10, $100, whatever it's going to be. So you give that amount of money, $5 or $10 or whatever the denomination was. Okay, I'm giving you that much money in return for the war bond. And on the back side of the document, it will have the repayment schedule. If you'll wait for, 1 year after the war, you'll get, let's say you bought it for $10, you'll get your $10 back plus $1. If you'll wait a year after the war to redeem this, you'll get your money back plus, let's say $1. If you wait 2 years, you'll get your money back plus, $2. If you wait 10 years, you'll double your money. $20, that's what you'll get back. So these war bonds are interest-bearing devices. These are interest-bearing monetary devices. You actually gave your government a short-term loan. So the government took in your money, and then they went out and fought the war. That's real money. But ladies and gentlemen, to get that money back, to be able to redeem that war bond, you have to be able to win. Your side has to win. And it's a form of gambling. You're gambling that your side's going to win. So you go out and get a bunch of war bonds on the premise that your side will win and you'll make money off this deal. So in 1862, the South was like issuing war bonds at a huge rate because they were beating the crap out of the North. That's a fact. But what does Wade Davis say? If you bought these war bonds, if you're a Southerner and you bought Confederate war bonds, you're not going to get your money back. You're never going to get that paid back. The money that you sent in to get this war bond, that's gone. So that would motivate people to fight on. Yes, no debt incurred by the Southern Confederacy to be assumed or paid off. That will motivate people to fight on. Again, think of Lincoln's position. If he saw that, he's like, no, we can't do that. Let's go to the next bullet point. Abolition of slavery and the guarantee of the rights of the freed slaves. So this was in the 10% plan as well. You're going to abolish slavery, okay. But look at the second half of this. Guarantee the rights of the freed slaves. Lincoln did not say he was going to do that in 10%. He only hinted at it. But what is Wade Davis saying? No, we're going to give them their rights. And politically, ladies and gentlemen, There's only one right we're interested in: giving these former slaves the right to vote. Now think of this in practical application. You're a slave owner in the South, and all of a sudden your slaves are freed. They were slaves on Monday, and on Tuesday not only are they freed, but they can vote, same as you. Now, as citizens, they're more or less equal. They had been slaves. They had no rights at all. And on Tuesday, not only are they free, but they have the right to vote. If you're a slave owner, or even if you're just a voter, you're ready to fight on to the end of the war. You're going to fight until the end. You're never going to let that happen. Turn slaves into, citizens? No. Again, Lincoln knows he has to kill this bill. Let's go on. No ranking Confederate politician or field officer. A field officer is major or above. A field officer is allowed to serve in government. Now, this prohibits a class of people from being part of the government. Strong note now, this is technical. I said it was technical, and so it is. What we're talking about here in Southern political society is a group of people commonly referred to as the planter aristocracy. The planter aristocracy. These are the major families of the South who had always been important, the rich, wealthy elite. And they had a sense of entitlement that they should be the politicians. They're going to be the leaders. They're the big landowners. They have a stake in it. They're the ones that got the best education. They have a stake in political leadership. They have a right to that. And so what's Wade Davis saying? This group of people had always been in power in the South. Suddenly they're out. They can't have any role in government anymore. Now, it is my view that that is almost certainly unconstitutional. You cannot identify a group of people and take their political rights away. Especially the Confederates, they felt that they had every right to fight the Civil War and do what they were doing. They felt that they were completely in their constitutional rights. They kept saying that. And here's Wade Davis saying, no, we're implying that you're traitors. They had a position on that, I have to say. And these Confederates are going to be very resentful. So again, think of Reconstruction. Think of Lincoln's position. That meant that this group of politicians and generals, they were going to fight to the very end. Because if they lost, they were going to face punishment for what they had done in the Civil War. And so they're going to fight. Again, Lincoln has to kill Wade Davis. Last but not least, large plantations are to be forfeited, broken up, and turned over to their former slaves. Now, ladies and gentlemen, on this one, I want you to think. All I ever want any of you guys to do in this class is think, think, think. Don't drift, think. Large plantation to be forfeited, broken up, and turned over to the former slaves. Now, is it fair to do that? Here's a group of people, laborers, who've been working on some great big giant plantation, one of these big farms, their whole lives, earning crops, making a profit for their master by the sweat of their brow. And they've been out there their whole lives working this land. And so suddenly they're free. They got no place to go. They don't know any other life. But we can take this plantation, break it up into small plots. Sidebar, this is the beginnings of a rumor, the beginnings of a story called 40 Acres and a Mule. Your book will talk about that a lot. And the idea was to take these plantations, break them up into 40-acre plots. 40 acres is thought of as the minimum amount of land that a man would need to be a farmer and be successful. So a 40-acre plot and give it to the slaves. Would that be fair? Would that give them employment? And by being landowners, would that also give them the vote? Is it fair to do that? Well, the answer is maybe. The question is it constitutional? And my position is no, it is not constitutional. That part is not constitutional. There's no place in our Constitution that allows the federal government to take property, in this case real estate, take property from one person and simply give it to another without compensation. You can't do that. It's unconstitutional. The government does not have that power. Now, some of you may be thinking, okay, well, what about eminent domain? Eminent domain is the idea that the government can approach you and say, it is better for the state or the better for the nation that you give up this land so that we can use it for something else. A state park or this or that or the other. So we're going to give you the fair market value of that land and you got to go. And then we'll turn it into this other thing. A specific example, a few years ago, there was a guy named Jerry Jones, and he decided he wanted a new football stadium for the Dallas Cowboys. You may have heard of all this. Well, the Dallas Cowboys had been playing in Texas Stadium since the 1960s, and they were like, okay, it's smaller now. We want to get rid of it. We want a modern facility. Okay, fair enough. So Jerry Jones identified a location for the stadium, and then went running down to the then governor, which was Rick Perry, and said, listen, this is where I want my stadium at. I got to get rid of all the people that are on that land in that location. And Rick Perry said, okay, we will do that. And the state of Texas contacted all those residents. It was a residential area. And said, listen, you got to give up your house. A house that you may have lived in for a long time, paid for. You got to give that up. We'll give you fair market value, but you got to go. Because we're going to bulldoze this and put in the stadium. And does that seem fair? Well, no, but is it constitutional? As it turns out, it is. If you offer them a fair market value for their home, you can take that home away from them. Now, nobody wanted that deal. There was a lot of people in Arlington where they put this stadium who didn't want to have anything to do with it. But I'm telling you right now, that football stadium is there. It's called Jerry World. And it's there. But that's not what we're talking about here. There's no eminent domain involved in this. And so that last part is almost certainly constitutional. So Lincoln had to kill Wade Davis. Lincoln had to kill it. If Wade Davis had actually gone through, Lincoln would have had to shoot every white man in the South. The war would never have ended. Never, never. The South would never have given up. And so Lincoln killed it with a pocket veto. And then in its place he put in the 10% plan. Now, in conclusion on this slide, and then we're going to go on to the Lincoln assassination, I have to say, I'm going over Wade Davis in this sort of excruciating detail, ladies and gentlemen, because we're going to see it later on. Lincoln, as you know, is going to get killed. That's about to happen, as it turns out. And so Wade Davis, at least a large part of it, is going to come back. That's why we're going over it now. 1862, Wade Davis. It has Wade Davis of 1864 because in 1864 it passed. But that was under Johnson. All right? So here we go. Now, as you all know, as many times as I teach this class, Lincoln gets killed every time. So in terms of Reconstruction, we just got to get Lincoln out of the way so we can get Johnson in. So let's go ahead and get Lincoln killed off. So here we are. It's April 14th, 1865. And Lincoln had been working 12, 14, 18-hour days. As you can imagine, the war was extremely, excruciatingly painful for him. There was this monster. He kept talking about his exhaustion. He says, I do get sleep, but it never touches the tired spot. And that is just, chronic exhaustion. Lincoln was under a lot of stress. One of his children had gotten sick and died. Little Willie, he was dead. Now, this was extremely stressful, as you can imagine. But on the 9th of April, Lee had surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, and that signaled the end of the war. And so Lincoln could finally relax. He could finally relax. So he decided he's going to take in a play. Now, more directly, Lincoln's assassination belongs in 1301. I'm only going over it briefly here so we get Lincoln out of the way. So he's going to go to the play. The play in Ford Theater in Washington, D.C. is called Our American Cousin. And it's a comedy. Back in those days, they called that a farce. We don't use the phrase farce enough. But it was a comedy, a light piece. It's about the trouble you get into between American English and British English. Our American Cousin. Which leads us then to John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth was a very famous actor. His entire family were, they were all actors, and they're very, very famous. Shakespearean. Very famous actors. Well, John Wilkes Booth was a familiar face then at the theater. He picked up his mail there. And it was there hanging around the theater, and somebody said, hey, Lincoln is going to come to see the play tonight. Well, John Wilkes Booth had had a conspiracy to kill Lincoln for years. He was from Virginia. He was a Southern sympathizer. And now he saw his chance. He went around and alerted the rest of the gang, hey, we're going to it's tonight. I'll do Lincoln. And you go over here and shoot this person. You go shoot that person, and on and on and on. Lincoln shows up with his wife, Mary Todd. They get seated. Everybody's ready to go. The play is on. And John Wilkes Booth, to make a long story short, saw his chance. He went up the stairwell and shot Lincoln from behind with a small caliber pistol. The bullet entered the left rear of Lincoln's skull, traveled across his brain pan, the lower part of his brain, and lodged behind his right eye. And as you can imagine, this is a fatal wound. It's fatal. There's no coming back from that. Lincoln went into an immediate coma. And that picture that you see there in the upper right, that's kind of an image of him, dying. Lincoln's letzte Stunde, that's good German. It means his last hour. Lincoln's last hour, the dernière heure de Lincoln. And that's in French, obviously. Lincoln lasted until about 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, and then he passed away. Now, John Wilkes Booth escaped. He jumped out of the presidential box, hit the stage, broke one of the bones in his lower left leg. He yelled "Sic semper tyrannis," which means "Thus be it always to tyrants," which is the motto of the state of Virginia. Booth got away. He was caught a couple of weeks later. He was in a tobacco barn, as it turns out, ironically, in Virginia. A Union Cavalry Patrol said, come out with your hands up. He came out, and one of them shot him. Now, you'd think historians would get this straight. One story has been shot in the neck, and the other in the body, in his upper torso. And that's the one I'm going for. The weapon that the cavalry was armed with is called a Spencer, and it has a 45-70 bullet, which is huge. If John Wilkes Booth had been shot in the neck with a 45-70, it would have blown his head right off his shoulders. But the bullet went into his body. It broke his spine from the inside. Booth told somebody, hold my hands in front of my face, and they did that. And he said, useless, useless, and he died. So the other conspirators were all captured. They were all rounded up, and they were put on trial. Now, again, the next image could be disturbing for some of you. They were put on trial. John Wilkes Booth, obviously, he was dead. Lewis Payne, also known as Powell, he was dead. He was captured. George Azerrod, who everybody agreed was, mentally deficient. He probably had the mental capacity of about a 10-year-old. There was something wrong with him. David Harrell, Mary Surratt, they're all put on trial. It's a military tribunal. Now, again, think about this. Is there any place in our Constitution which allows civilians to be tried in a military court-martial in time of peace? And the answer, of course, is no. So the reason why it was a military tribunal is twofold. Number one, it was going to be fast. Number two, everybody knew what the outcome was going to be. And sure enough, it was fast and direct. And the people involved in the conspiracy, they were hanged up, as you can see. So Lincoln then is dead. He's no longer there. And that's going to lead us then to his then vice president, Johnson. So with that in mind, let's go to Andrew Johnson. So Johnson, I will actually put him as the lead-in slide in part 2. I'm dividing up Reconstruction right here. So this is a repeat of our lead-in slide. Our thesis is going to be Reconstruction is a failure. I've shown you some of the basics of the reason why. I've talked about the United States at the close of the war. We've talked about the Constitution. Again, Reconstruction is highly technical. We've taken a look at Lincoln's point of view and Congress's point of view. And in the next series of presentations, in the next presentation, part 2, it'll be the Johnson administration, Congressional Military Reconstruction, Congressional and Military Reconstruction, especially Military Reconstruction. Again, it's going to be, broadly speaking, unconstitutional. But then I'll spend a lot of time on why they did it. Then again, in part 2, we'll go through the election of 1876, which will lead to the Compromise of 1877, and then a conclusion. So thank you all very much for your patience. From here, go on to part 2. It'll start with Johnson and get through to the end of Reconstruction.